One of the issues that we run into with art, especially in this time period, especially in the English-speaking world, there is not a lot of images of lower-class people. We have to rely a lot on Dutch artists, some of the French artists. A lot of what we're stuck with are images of the upper class and a few scattered engravings, which aren't always the best when it comes to detail. I mentioned in one of my previous videos about replicating the jacket seen in the one Navy frontispiece. There's a few artifacts that have survived, clothing-wise, that shed some light on the construction of the time period, some of the styles of the time period, but a lot of it was upper class. Part of recreating this time period is trying to figure out what would a normal person wear. With military formation, you have the luxury of regulations. Of course, epic battles, you want to have artists painting those epic battles, and you want them done as soon as possible before the thrill of the epic battle has worn off. So you'll see, oh, this is what this unit was wearing. With the Navy, you have the slop contract, so you at least know what would have been available to the soldiers. You don't know exactly what it looked like, keep that in mind. But you have a rough idea of the colors used, the styles to a certain extent used, how many pockets, how many buttons. With civilian clothing, it gets a little harder. Now, I alluded in my video on King Charles II, there was a very steady secondhand market for clothing, which sadly helped lead to the spread of the plague. But eventually, once the plague fizzled out, it became popular again. A lot of these secondhand clothes, as valuable as they were to the people in the time period, and to a certain extent with the secondhand market we still have today, it's still a valuable market. The problem is we lost a lot of the artifacts of that time period. One of the irritating parts with looking through museum pieces, sometimes you'll see something labeled 17th century, and you look at it and it's like, oh, that's not 17th century. And then it turns out, at some point in time, somebody in the family, let's say it was granddad's breeches, that would have been a fly front, they decided to take fabric from, let's say, his waistcoat and make it a fall front. Or if they had some of the fabric still on hand, make it a fall front. This practice continued well into the 19th century. We still see it today. I mean, the cosplay community, for example, there's a lot of things. Oh, wow, look at this leather jacket from the 70s that probably might be valuable in a few decades. It's going to be my post-apocalyptic jacket. If you were working class, you had a lot of things to spend money on and not enough money to spread it out. Clothing, of course, would have been something you 100% necessary. If clothing wore out, you'd patch it. If it wore out or you outgrew it, or you'd modify it. You would, if you had a jacket on hand that like maybe wasn't, like you maybe had something better, you know what, you could chop that up, give it to your kids. They'd get clothes out of it. Toadspool Tailoring recently did an excellent series of posts on Facebook on actually taking a yard of fabric and making a jacket out of it. Now that's earlier to mid 17th century, but it was the same sort of mindset in this time period. With this suit project, I wanted to make something that would fit in for working class, maybe a lower end merchant, something that they would have worn during, let's say, walking through 1690's Philadelphia or Boston, possibly even walking around Antwerp. I wanted to combine features that would have been seen in upper class, things that would have started to come in, but also mix it with some of the styles and fittings that were older. So, let's start with these pockets, actually. When I started making these pockets, I was like, oh wow, I think these are too big. And then I compared it to an image and, oh, sure enough, they are actually the right size. These are accidentally based on the pockets from the one engraving of Blackbeard. But they fit within the style of pocket flaps progressively getting larger. If you notice, where they fit on the jacket is a lot lower than what you'd expect in later eras with their coats. It's unlined, which saves on fabric. Now, some of the surviving jackets, they aren't felling the seams. The seams are really nasty. I tend to fall all my seams just because this is the 21st century. A lot of people don't know how to sew in their day-to-day life and fix things. So I try to make things a little stronger than they would have been necessarily done in the time period. But yeah, pockets are a little lower, but trying to keep up with the style, so they got a larger flap. The cut of the jacket itself, with some modification, would have worked throughout from the mid-17th century up through the 18th century. A jacket of this type would have been something that anybody who could sew, who had, oh, my old worn-out jacket, that fit me great, but I mean, it's past the point of no return with it. I need a new one. Let's chop it up and make a pattern out of it. It wasn't as easy as going online and looking up patterns. Patterns were something that, if you didn't have the money to go to a tailor, if you didn't have the money to go to a slop shop, if you didn't necessarily have the money to buy secondhand clothes that were complete, you would need to have some awareness of how clothes were made. As a tailor, we tend to get stuck in the world of tailors. Like, there's several treatises. Tailors, yes, would have been literate. The problem is, if you didn't have the money to go to the tailor, you had to do all of this yourself. Now the buttons, these would have been, the material to make them would have been cheap. You could have used just about any thread that you had on hand with a wooden core, even a cloth core, and made nice looking buttons. Now the breeches I had fun with. Now, typically when we look at a lot of late 17th century, some of your baggier breeches, this style was starting to go out. But it would continue. You would still see it in images into the 18th century. But it was starting to go on its way out. It took way too much fabric. But if you were trying to look a little bit fancy, why not? These I did cheat and use a slightly larger button. This is to be a little bit more secure because, I mean, we live in modern times. People get freaked out at the slightest amount of, you know, nudity. Yeah. This time period is a little bit different. You see plenty of images of, not even sailors, just normal townspeople with their fly partially open because there wasn't an extra button there. The folds on the front actually work to partially hide the fly. Now if you notice, these have horizontal pockets. This was a style that, there's several surviving examples with this style of pocket. I have never really seen them reproduced, and I just was like, you know, this would be nice to have. A lot of existing trousers and breeches, you don't see anything covering the little split in the back. Again, this is the modern world. We have to think for the modern consumer who's going to be in public. Now, supporting it is some cheaper, heavier duty, it could have been made out of hemp. In this case, it's heavier duty linen. The pocket flaps themselves, the pocket linings, are actually made with just scrap fabric I have lying around. This was from another project. I think those are linen, or maybe they actually... Those are hemp, if I remember correctly. Cabbage is what it was called in the time period. It would basically be whatever you have left over from your sewing. Now the bottoms of these, you see ties, you see buttons, sometimes you see ties and buttons, sometimes you see nothing at all. This is just a real quick, this is a cheaper way of doing it. You're using less materials, you're not wasting all your time making buttons. One of the styles of the time period was to actually cover the bottoms with stockings. Some images show it, some images don't. Nobody's really going to see what's going on here. And even if they did, you'd usually have, if you did have your stockings under your breeches, you might end up wearing something over top of that. But if not, the ties, they're neutral, they blend in. Now, one thing I skipped on this, I did not put a watch pocket in this. Watch pockets do appear, they even appear in military issue clothing. I'm looking from the perspective of somebody wants a nice looking outfit as quickly as possible. They can't afford a watch. One thing that used to really annoy me when I was studying textiles was leaving raw edges. So, right there's a raw edge. If you had decent enough wool, you could get away with that, and it saves time. In some cases, you want to show off how nice the wool is, but most of the time it really is just saving time. This is a thicker wool broadcloth. This would have been something that, if you were wealthy, it would be fairly warm in winter. If you're poor, though, a fabric like this is a really good working cloth. It's not going to wear out as fast. It's going to be somewhat tough. And to answer any of you who have ever asked that stereotypical question that gets asked at reenactments, are you hot in that? Yes and no. Wool was one of the more common fabrics used by just about everybody at this time period. It was affordable. One of the big issues with the calico industry was cotton was starting to become way too affordable, and it was starting to put the wool market in jeopardy. Naturally, Britain was not too happy about losing one of its more important trade items. Wool, as a natural fabric, breathes. Most of your natural fabrics will breathe. You're also wearing layers underneath. So, in this case, I'd be wearing a linen shirt underneath. There's air pockets, there's airflow. You actually aren't as hot as you might think. Now, if you are comparing this to, let's say, modern fabrics, you cannot really compare historic fabrics to modern fabrics. I've been able to wear wool in 90-degree weather without, it's hot. It was hot back then. Wearing wool is a lot more comfortable than, let's say, a synthetic fabric windbreaker or something in 90-degree heat. It's not the same. Even though that windbreaker is a lot lighter than this fabric, there's still airflow. Wool is somewhat water repellent. So if you're working on a ship and you don't want to get completely drenched, it's going to help you a little bit. A little bit. The one issue with it being a tighter woven broadcloth, it feels a lot more rigid than, let's say, a lighter wool or a linen. With wear, even over the course of a day, you'd break it in a little bit better. It's one of the few times where you can actually take your modern experience and apply it to the past. One thing that really needs to be stressed when talking about history in general, people's basic mentality does not change much. People are always going to look at something that's new and different, but also kind of stylish and be, I want that. It happens throughout time. Well, hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, like, subscribe, share it with your friends. We will actually be selling this jacket on the... if you enjoyed the video, like, subscribe, share it with your friends. We will actually be selling this suit on the Crew the Fancy Facebook group. Probably do it as a mass sale, which basically, make an offer. You might get it. Take care. Have an awesome day.